Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see so many faces. So this event is something which has been announced only a week ago, and I think for that we have a really good turnout, which speaks to the importance of the topic. And for us here at the DAI, it's very important to be a house for debates. And I think our event tonight mirrors this intent. My name is Lena Jürg. I'm the director here at the DAI, at the German American Institute. And as I said, we are very committed to creating spaces where different perspectives and viewpoints can be articulated, challenged, and discussed openly on stage, and also, of course, with our audience, with all of you. So today you will have the possibility to ask questions. We think that dialogue, critical thinking, and respectful disagreement are at the heart of what we do, because democratic societies depend on exactly that exchange. At the DAI, we also are very convinced and deeply rooted in the idea of transatlantic relationship, a partnership that reaches back many decades and has profoundly shaped our societies. And I think our house really represents this. As some of you might know, we celebrate 80 years of America House and German American Institute this year. And this relationship, the transatlantic relationship and friendship, goes far beyond government and diplomacy. It lives in civil society, in education, and in research, in cultural exchange, and in countless personal connections between people in Germany, in Europe, and in the United States. And these ties continue to influence how we understand democracy, security, and cooperation today. And tonight's event is part of a series called Schlaglicht USA. You might have seen the flyers on your seats, Spotlight USA. And in this series, we take a closer look at current political developments in the United States and their broader implications, including for Europe and for the transatlantic partnership. Our goal, once again there, is also not to provide simple answers, but to foster informed discussion and reflection. And now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, Fred Fleitz and Florian Böller. Fred Fleitz served as Deputy Assistant to President Donald Trump and as Chief of Staff of the US National Security Council. Over the course of more than 25 years, he has held senior positions in US national security policy, giving him first-hand insights into political decision-making. He has worked extensively on questions concerning NATO, European security, nuclear non-proliferation, and US relations with China, Iran, and North Korea. Fred Fleitz is Vice Chair of the American First Policy Institute. This is a think tank which was founded in 2021, and its leadership and senior staff consists of at least some former Trump administration officials. And Fred Fleitz told me earlier that many of the people who were former administration or worked in the former administration now returned to the current administration. Fred Fleitz is also the author and editor of several books, including his latest book, which came out in 2024 with the title An American First Approach to US National Security. I'm also very pleased to welcome our second guest and conversation partner, Florian Böller. Florian Böller is Senior Lecturer in Political Science at the Center for American Studies here at the University Heidelberg. His research focuses on US foreign policy, executive power, and transatlantic security relations. We're grateful to have his expertise and thoughtful guidance for tonight's discussion, especially because this was very short notice. So thank you very much for being available or making yourself available tonight. Florian Böller also worked at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and at the Center for European Studies of the Harvard University. Before we begin, I would like to extend our thanks to the US Consulate General. Some representatives are also here tonight. And yeah, I just want to thank you for your support and also for making this event possible. With that, please join me in welcoming Fred Fleitz and Florian Böller. First, Fred Fleitz will kick off the evening with a short lecture, about 15 to 20 minutes, and this will be followed by a conversation with Florian Böller. And as I said before, then after about an hour, you have the opportunity to ask questions. I wish us a very insightful discussion tonight and a possibility to learn about different perspectives. So please welcome with me Fred Fleitz to the German American Institute.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be speaking here before the German American Institute. I'm grateful for the invitation, and it is so impressive that so many of you came out to hear this presentation today. I think it speaks to the interests of the German people in U.S.-German relations and in world affairs, so I salute you for that. The history of our two nations is a bond forged in the fires of the Cold War, strengthened by our shared commitment to Western civilization. From the Berlin airlift to the fall of the wall, the United States and Germany have proved that we are at our best when we stand shoulder to shoulder in defense of sovereign values. The American people will forever be grateful to Germany for the support your country offered us after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. You sent 3,500 soldiers to Afghanistan to fight alongside our soldiers. You suffered 62 fatalities and many more casualties. We recognize that Germany's commitment to our mutual security is not just a line item in a budget, but is about the lives of your sons and daughters. We honor you for that service, and we thank you. These historic ties are not artifacts in a museum. They are the foundation of our shared security. This is a permanent, long-term relationship that will outlive the disagreements of the moment. This is not to say there will not be disagreements. There will be changes. There will be things we have to discuss, but we will resolve them as friends like we always have. Now, I want to talk about the Trump approach to U.S. national security. I've done a lot of work on that. I worked on this in the first Trump administration. As was mentioned, I've written a book on this that I co-authored with my close friend and colleague, General Keith Kellogg, who had been President Trump's special envoy for Ukraine. He just returned to our think tank. And it is an approach that is different. It is typical for Donald Trump. It's an out-of-the-box way of looking at the world. It has introduced some changes and caused some disagreements in America's relationship with many nations, including its NATO allies in Europe. These issues stem from different approaches to foreign policy by President Trump and U.S. conservatives, some new security challenges, and some differences between the U.S. and Europe. The America First approach is many things, but one thing it is primarily is President Trump's effort to promote peace. This is a president of peace who has fought hard to resolve conflicts that many people thought was unsolvable. He succeeded in getting a fragile peace deal to end the war, well, at least temporarily end the war in Gaza with a shaky ceasefire. He began a process for peace talks with Putin that did not exist before he was president. And he's working to resolve many other wars. Love him or hate him, Trump's determination to promote peace, to stop the killing, is a real driver of the policy of this president. Now, many call this approach the America First approach to U.S. national security, but it is better described as the Trump Doctrine because the America First term sounds like isolationism or America alone, and it is not. And contrary to what you may have heard from CNN or the New York Times, the Trump Doctrine is not anti-European. It is not the end of NATO or the end of the rules-based global order. In fact, as the National Security Strategy explains, and this is a strategy required by the U.S. Congress that every administration has to put out on how it will carry out foreign policy. The Trump Doctrine is intended to promote European greatness and emphasizes America's emotional attachment to Europe. So what is this strategy? What is the Trump Doctrine? It is a form of realist nationalism that is intended to preserve the United States as a sovereign, independent republic, secure the natural rights and well-being of its citizens. It calls for taking control of U.S. borders. It is a doctrine that puts the interests of the United States, the American people, our economy, and the American way of life first when U.S. officials make foreign and economic policy decisions. This especially means when sending U.S. troops abroad, but it also includes when signing treaties or trade deals. There's a perception by many Americans that some prior Republican and Democratic presidents made foreign policy decisions or signed treaties that the so-called foreign policy elite loved, but were not actually in the interest of the American people, and if were put to a vote in Congress, wouldn't have passed. So this is something the Trump Doctrine tries to get passed. It is also crucial in the doctrine in how it calls for the U.S. to have the world's strongest military, deterrence, and economy. By significantly strengthening defense spending and modernizing the nuclear triad, the Trump administration wants to ensure that adversaries like Russia and China understand the cost of aggression. It means peace through strength, and American strength is the best deterrent. This approach also, however, includes a predisposition to non-intervention, but allows the use of military force when necessary to promote the security of the U.S. and its allies. The Trump Doctrine is not isolationism. It is not America alone. It includes working closely with alliances and our allies, but it also calls for pressing alliance members to take responsibility for defending their regions. It means working with the UN and multilateral organizations when it is in U.S. interests, but it does not permit ceding sovereignty or foreign policy decision-making to the UN. A principal element of this document is the primacy of the nation-state over transnational bodies. Now, much of what I said reflects pretty clearly what was being done in the first Trump term, but there's significant differences in this strategy in the second term, and President Trump explained some of them in an important speech he gave in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia last May, in which he said he wanted to bring about peace in the Middle East through commerce, not chaos. And he said he did not believe America should have permanent enemies. And he denounced so-called nation builders and neocons and Western interventionists, and he was referring to prior Republican and Democratic presidents, for failed policies that he said destabilized the region. What Trump was doing was sending a message to Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea that the U.S. wanted to end hostile relations with them and pursue trade deals to promote mutual prosperity. Trump was communicating to these states that he wanted to find ways for the U.S. to coexist with them, to coexist with different systems. Now, I want to talk about NATO and Ukraine, which I'm sure a lot of you would like to talk about. Stopping the killing in Ukraine has always been a high priority for Trump, even before he was elected for a second term. The national security strategy reflects this sentiment by stating that quickly ending the war in Ukraine is a core interest of the United States. That's a core interest of Donald Trump. He has said over and over again, his priority for this conflict is stopping the killing. And the objectives of this is to stop the war and to prevent escalation of it, to implement post-war reconstruction of Ukraine to enable its survival as a viable state, and stabilizing European economies. Now, there's been some tension between the U.S. and Ukraine and the U.S. and European states over the Trump strategy on Ukraine, and a lot of it had to deal with the fact that Trump came into office wanting a ceasefire, and there were other parties who thought there should be a more comprehensive agreement. There should be some way to hold Putin accountable. But Trump's objective was to stop the killing. That had to be done first. But fortunately, right now, European and Ukrainian leaders are now on the same page with the U.S. There soon will be a security guarantees agreement. I think we're very close to one. There would not be one between the U.S. and Ukraine without the input from Europe. NATO members, the U.S. recently held 2 rounds of trilateral talks for the first time that reportedly went well. And at the same time, President Trump recently endorsed a bipartisan Senate bill to put strong economic sanctions on Russia. My personal view is that although there seems to have been some progress in the recent trilateral talks, there'll be another round this week, I think in the UAE. I don't believe peace is near in Ukraine. I believe that there's going to have to be strong international resolve and very stiff sanctions against Russia to force Putin to begin to negotiate in good faith and agree to a ceasefire. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my personal opinion. Some of the tension between the U.S. and NATO over the Ukraine war concern how Trump wants to change and reform NATO. Trump has been critical of NATO leaders, and he's also been critical of President Biden for not doing enough to stop this war, and notes that there were no peace negotiations with Putin before he became president. But his strategy also involves reestablishing a strategic stability with Russia. Related to this goal, it calls for ending NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance, but also it deals with the belief that continuing to isolate and demonizing Russia is driving it into the arms of China. And this is in turn empowering and strengthening a Russia-China axis, which I believe is a far more serious threat to global security than the Ukrainian war. Many of us who advise President Trump, and I'm not saying that Trump shares this view, believe that we have to have a long-term strategy for Russia. If we end the war, what will Russia's place in the world be? I believe a way should be found to welcome Russia back as a state in good standing of Europe. Russia is a European state through history. It's not an Asian state. This may not be possible while Putin is still in office, but the proposals Trump has raised of making the G7 the G8 again to welcome Putin in, there's a good reason for doing that. Working with the Russians as colleagues is a heck of a lot best than preparing for war. And I think long-term the U.S. and our NATO allies should be thinking about that, to think of a strategy not just to end the war, but what will our relationship be with Putin afterwards. Perhaps if we do that, there won't be invasions of any other states. I don't think Putin plans to invade NATO members, but it worries me that he will invade members like Moldova and Georgia, and I think we have to do everything possible to set the stage so that won't happen. If you want to know where the Trump administration is on Europe and NATO, listen to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He gave an extraordinary testimony last week before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in which he talked about America's support for NATO, America's support for Europe. He said that although U.S. is seeking flexibility to shift some military forces from Europe, we're not pulling out of NATO, we're not pulling out of Europe, but we may need to shift some forces to the Indo-Pacific to deal with threats from China. Rubio said that NATO has to be reimagined because the United States can't simply be focused on Europe, has defense needs in the Western Hemisphere and the Indo-Pacific, and does not have unlimited resources. There's some broader concerns about U.S.-NATO relations. The Trump Doctrine has talked about how the U.S. I have to get some water, excuse me. Excuse me. The Trump Doctrine believes that energy security is national security, and Trump has urged European states many times that it is crucial not to be dependent on energy imports from Russia, and that these imports have to end as soon as possible. And I know there's moves to do that by the European Union, but their deadline is early 2027. And in the eyes of many in the Trump administration, that isn't soon enough. I know Germany has made major strides in separating itself from energy imports from Russia, but it's a big issue to the President. Another issue is trade. The national security and national defense strategies call for free, fair, and balanced trade as a priority in the Trump Doctrine. This means lowering barriers for those who don't play by the rules, while ensuring that U.S. openness is not exploited by state-led economies that don't share our commitment to fair competition. We got big problems and differences over trade between the U.S. and the EU. I think we all know that. We have to be honest about our disagreements, whether it's on tariffs, subsidies, or digital regulation. However, we can't let these friction points fraction our broader alliance. We can work these things through as friends, and progress, I think, is being made to do so. Israel and Iran have been big priorities for President Trump in his 1 year in office and are big parts of the Trump Doctrine and are examples of how the Trump Doctrine has been adapted for the second term. Ending the war in Gaza, promoting a Middle East peace, and stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons are very high priorities for President Trump. Trump has always been a strong friend of Israel and the Jewish people. Standing with Israel is a key element of the Trump Doctrine, and I think you can see that in the way Trump has conducted his foreign policy. Trump's Gaza war peace effort led to the historic 20-point peace plan last October that succeeded in Hamas freeing all live Israeli hostages and a shaky ceasefire that's still in place. A second phase in this plan has begun, and it was announced at the Davos summit with the announcement of the Board of Peace that will begin a new phase in the peace plan to rebuild Gaza in stages and hopefully bring about peace and prosperity. We hope Hamas will completely cooperate with this deal. Right now, it doesn't look like it's going to, but I think the plan, as Jared Kushner explained in Davos, was that we will start rebuilding and demilitarizing areas of Gaza that we have cleaned Hamas out of. So the plan is going to go forward, I believe, with or without Hamas's assistance. But this is a plan that has incredible prospects for promoting Middle East stability and the welfare of the Palestinian people. That's why there's such extraordinary support from it for every Arab state. Even the Palestinian Authority signed on to this plan, which nobody expected. President Trump gave a green light to Israel's massive attacks against Iran last June and later ordered U.S. airstrikes because he believes an Iranian nuclear bomb is an unacceptable threat to global security. These attacks, the American attacks and the Israeli attacks, substantially set back Iran's nuclear weapons program. I believe it has postponed it for at least 5 to 10 years. Now, America was honored by German Chancellor Merz's principled support for the U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran, especially when he described Israel's attacks as the dirty work Israel is doing for all of us, and said there was no reason to criticize U.S. or Israeli attacks because of evidence that Iran was pursuing nuclear weapons. In America, we were so grateful to hear this because there was a lot of criticism from some of our friends. There were honest disagreements, but I think Merz went out on a limb to say something that needed to be said. And I know those of us in the U.S. who studied the Iranian nuclear program, we were very grateful for his support. Merz also distinguished himself from other European leaders when he was one of the first to forcefully condemn the brutal crackdown by Iran's theocratic autocracy to crush protests by millions of Iranians demanding freedom, when he said on January 12th, "If a regime can only keep itself in power by force, then it's effectively at the end. I believe we are now seeing the final days of this regime." I believe that too. Popular support for the Iranian regime had been waning for some time. I believe the Israeli and U.S. airstrikes significantly weakened this regime, and the significantly increased sanctions, and they were increased substantially last September when France, the UK, and Germany agreed to snap back JCPOA nuclear sanctions. These were sanctions that were suspended due to the 2015 nuclear deal, but the UK, Germany, and France voted to put them back in place, would put a lot more pressure on Iran. I think this really increased the pressure on the Iranian regime, as did the humiliation of the Iranian government when they were able to do nothing to stop the U.S. and Israeli airstrikes, and the U.S. and Israel didn't suffer any losses. We will see what's going to happen in Iran right now. I don't think we can bomb away the Iranian regime or the supreme leader. Military force may play a role in weakening the Revolutionary Guard Corps, perhaps attacking weapons depots. But my belief, and this is what I've been advising the administration, is that we need a long-term strategy with our allies to isolate this regime, to put up large cash payments to encourage members of this regime to defect, or cash payments to military commanders who order their troops not to fire on protesters. There should be efforts to improve communications in Iran, internet connectivity. There should be cyber warfare against the government to make it harder for it to communicate with itself, to order attacks on protesters. There's other things that can be done. But my message on what's going on in Iran is that this will be hard. It will be hard to get rid of this regime. I think they're going down. It may take years. It's going to be bloody and long. And I think we have to be ready for a long-term effort, and the U.S. and its allies need to work on this together to isolate the Iranians. One thing that the Trump administration recently did that was a great move was expelling from the United States all the relatives of Iranian leaders who were living in the U.S. Many of them were going to school in the U.S. I hope Germany will expel anyone related to the Iranian regime, anyone related in committing atrocities. Their families should not be allowed to live in Germany if they're still Iranian citizens. So that's just I don't want to meddle in your politics, but that's just my advice. On the Western Hemisphere, we've seen some pretty significant developments, and a surprise when people read the national security strategy that this was such a significant focus of the strategy. And there are two reasons for this. The one reason is the belief by President Trump that the enormous flow of illegal migrants and drugs and gangs that occurred during the Biden administration can't be allowed to reoccur. And for him, it's not just enough to seal the southern border. He wants to address the source of the instability that caused all these things to flow into the United States. And that means reasserting American leadership and control over the Western Hemisphere, basically reinstituting the Monroe Doctrine. The second point was that the U.S. is not going to tolerate Russia, China, and Iran establishing a foothold in South America, which they will use to undermine U.S. influence. The operation to take out or to capture illegitimate President Maduro was a law enforcement operation based on indictments by the Biden and the Trump administrations. It was a remarkable, successful military raid, but I also think it's a one-off. It reflected the incredible capabilities of the U.S. military, but also the incredible incompetence of the Maduro regime that they allowed that to happen. And I know that some people, I've been giving talks all week long, and I've been asked a couple of times, are we going to do that to the supreme leader in Iran? And my answer is no, of course we're not. The Iranian regime has a much more capable military, and I also think the element of surprise is gone now. Even if the U.S. thought it could do that, I think the heads of states of American adversaries worldwide are on notice of what is possible. The bottom line for this operation is that, and this is a key point of both strategies, is that the Trump administration believes the era of mass migration is over. It's certainly over for the United States, and as you know, that this has been mentioned concerning how mass migration has affected European security and stability also. Also part of this focus is securing the Arctic from current and future security threats and for economic reasons. President Trump thinks the status of Greenland has to be updated to deal with security threats from Russia and China. NATO's Secretary General Rutte said he agrees with Trump that there has to be a change in Greenland's status and came up with a framework agreement that the U.S. and Denmark are currently discussing. I think this issue is, we're moving past this issue right now. I know there's been a lot of concern over it, but the very strong relationship we have with our NATO allies, I don't think is going to be derailed over disagreements concerning Greenland. On the Indo-Pacific, the Trump administration calls for promoting stability and security through collective defense, leading from a position of strength, free and fair trade with China, and also diplomacy with Beijing. Now, there's two different approaches in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy on these issues. The national security strategy calls for the U.S. to deny aggression anywhere on the first island chain and for U.S. allies in the region to do more for collective defense. It calls for a free and open Asia-Pacific. It calls for Japan and Korea to increase their military spending, defense capabilities, and to develop new military capabilities. The National Defense Strategy is similar but takes a slightly different approach. It discusses the American desire for stable peace, fair trade, and respectful relations with China. This strategy calls for rebalancing America's economic relationship with China, prioritizing reciprocity, efforts to restore America's economic independence. This strategy says the U.S. wants a balance of power with China, but not to humiliate China. And the Trump administration will pursue these goals from a position of strength, through deterrence, and through engagement with Beijing. It's similar to what I said earlier about how we're going to be tough with China, but also engage with China. And President Trump is planning to visit Beijing in April, and I think we're going to see how the strategy will be rolled out. So to wrap up and to return to my opening remarks, the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy represent new approaches to promoting American and global security in light of emerging security threats. They represent improvements and corrections to previous failed U.S. policies. They represent improvements to the rule-based international order, not a replacement of this order. They press for free, fair, and unbalanced trade. It is a doctrine that is in line with U.S. and European values and security concerns, but reflects some cold realities about new global threats, especially from Russia and China. It talks about how we need to work together to make adjustments in our policies to deal with these threats. It is a doctrine that calls for our alliances and allies to do more to defend their regions, to engage in free and fair trade, but values our alliances and defense partnerships. The U.S. and Germany have had a long and productive relationship and friendship. Germany is the linchpin of transatlantic security, a friend and ally that is absolutely vital to American security. We may not completely agree on the Trump doctrine. There may be issues from time to time. We'll disagree on other things. But I believe this is an American foreign policy aimed at strengthening our crucial security alliances and a strong America to promote global peace and security. So thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions and a dialogue.
Yeah, thank you so much for your first input, Fred. We appreciate you coming to Heidelberg and talk to us. As we said in our conversation before, we seldom have guests from the United States who are affiliated with the Trump administration or have been working in a national security role in the administration. So we are really looking forward to this and to start a conversation. Let me say that you know, we Germans sometimes have the tendency to see everything very pessimistic. So I think overall your input was very diplomatic, maybe optimistic. The packaging of Trump's strategy sounded very reassuring. Maybe with some questions and in our conversation we'll open the packaging a little bit more again. So we enter now the second phase of our evening, and I have prepared a couple of questions, but we also are gonna ask you for questions where you can focus on issues that interest you. We'll not be able to cover everything that you touched on. You mentioned many areas of Trump's foreign policy. But we agreed that we focus on foreign and security policy here. And before we start, let me also echo some things that Dr. Jung mentioned, namely that it's very interesting to have someone here who worked within the administration, so knows the policy process, knows how policies are actually created. at the center of government in the United States. And I think it's also very brave that you come here to a university town, which is quite liberal leaning, as you may know, and to face our questions. So I want to start with one question relating to your role as Chief of Staff of the National Security Council during the first Trump administration. And for our audience, the National Security Council is the principal advisory body on national security. It's there to advise the president, to coordinate between the various departments. And so my question would be, can you give us an idea how inside the White House the decision-making process works, how national security strategies are being designed and how they are implemented in the end in policy making? Can you give us maybe unclassified, of course, examples of that?
Of course. Well, I'm ready for tough questions. I've been doing the BBC lately, and they don't they don't like America at all. These are interesting questions because the National Security Council is different in the second Trump term. It's smaller. Secretary of State Rubio is both National Security Advisor and National Security and Secretary of State. He has several other jobs. I can't keep track of all of them, but I believe that Rubio's rise as a very trusted advisor to President Trump is in the interest of our country and President Trump. It's in the interest of Germany. This is a man who is chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee, has a deep understanding of the Western Hemisphere, of Europe, of NATO, of Asia. He really was one of Trump's best cabinet picks, so I'm very glad he was chosen, and I hope he'll be in Europe soon for you to hear his statements. And this testimony I mentioned he gave to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you can watch it on YouTube, and it is really extraordinary. I think it will reassure you if you had some concerns about U.S.-German relations. The National Security Council is supposed to be a gatekeeper between the various agencies, but it's a little different in this administration because the president seems to rely on a trusted group of advisors to make advice. There is a National Security Council staff, and there are people who run it, but it is less prominent than it was in the past. And foreign policy, I think, is really being directed by Secretary of State Rubio. It isn't being overseen by the National Security Advisor, which is typical, as we've seen in U.S. governments for like 60 years. It's a different way of doing things. There was talk, now Michael Waltz had been National Security Advisor. He did not work out. He's now ambassador to the UN. There was talk that Waltz would be replaced, there'd be a new National Security Advisor, and I thought that was going to happen. But President Trump seems comfortable with this arrangement of Rubio holding both hats. And one reason it works is because the Trump National Security team gets along so well, they cooperate well. John Ratcliffe is part of this, the Secretary of Defense is part of this. They just work together in cooperation as colleagues. And I think that's why, we saw in the first term, it seems like Trump foreign policy officials were being fired every month. There haven't been any who have been let go so far, because I think Trump found a group of people who know what his objectives are and are prepared to implement them, and he found a group of people who can work together.
I mean, you worked for John Bolton in the first Trump administration, and as you know, he in the end was a little bit critical of the president. So he published a book, and in the book he stated that he had to repeatedly hold back or talk out the president from withdrawing from NATO. Would that align with your experience of how the advisory process in the White House should work? Or would you see that there is a difference now, that these conflicts don't emerge anymore?
I have some strong opinions about John Bolton. I've known John for decades. I worked for him when he was Chief of Staff for Arms Control in the State Department during the first Bush administration. I worked for him for 5 months in the first Trump administration. I resigned after 5 months, had some disagreements with the way he was carrying out his job and his differences on policy with the president. Bolton came in not agreeing with things that Trump wanted to do. and it caused real problems, real tension between him and the president. We have not spoken since January 2020 because he announced his tell-all book. I think it's called Inside the Room, which you're quoting from. And in this book, Bolton revealed a lot of candid conversations he had with the president in the Oval Office. Now, I wrote to Bolton, and I said, you can't publish a book like this. You can't compromise candid advice as National Security Advisor you gave the President of the United States. How can the President trust anyone if the National Security Advisor is fired and then writes a tell-all book on all the things he told the President in confidence about sensitive policy issues? So frankly, I don't put a lot of weight to anything Bolton wrote in that book. I'm outraged he wrote it. I think he really, I think it was a real stain on his reputation that he chose to do this. And we want the president to trust a large variety of advisors, including people who he doesn't know. And when someone as prominent as Bolton did this, it set a terrible precedent, both for the Trump president and future presidents. So, you know, I think there has to be a real understanding that can't happen again.
But between the lines, that basically means if you're angry at Bolton's book, there's some truth in it, because otherwise you would not need to be, you know, criticizing him.
Of course there's truth in Bolton's book, but there's also things I don't think are true. I think there's things that he projected or assumed was going on. And Bolton didn't simply compromise the confidence of the president. He also revealed confidential conversations he had with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, a lot of them. Pompeo was pretty angry at this. Pompeo thought that when they had private meetings to talk about how to make policy with the president, these meetings were private. They weren't going to be published in a book that someone gets $1 million in advance to publish. So you want my views on Bolton, there they are.
Okay, well, thanks for being so open about that. I want to turn our attention to the issue of NATO and alliance politics. So you mentioned in the beginning of your talk how the alliance is founded on, or looks back on a history of 75, 80 years. And of course there have been crises within NATO, within the transatlantic alliance. Would you say that the current phase is just sort of the usual disagreement between democratic societies?
There's always going to be disagreements between democratic societies. One country may elect a leader the other country or the other alliance doesn't like. There'll be policies that alliances may disagree on. But I think the issue of an enduring alliance over time is how we have to think about NATO, how we need NATO, how the US needs NATO, how Europe needs NATO. And I believe that is what Secretary Rubio explained in his testimony last week. Not that there won't be changes. As I said, he wants to reimagine NATO because the US needs flexibility to be able to deal with threats elsewhere, and we don't have unlimited resources. That doesn't mean NATO's going away, or the US is backing out of or out of NATO. And I think part of the issue we've seen with issues like this is that the Trump administration has been extraordinary in that it rolled out a huge number of policy initiatives in a single year. And I think it confused many of our friends and allies. It confused people in the United States. And there are a variety of reasons for that. First of all, we had a president who had 4 years to think about his first term. What did he do right? What did he do wrong? He had 4 years to task his friends and allies and friendly think tanks to write initiatives so he could, the day he's inaugurated, he could implement policies instantly. And he signed a record number of executive orders when he was, just after he was sworn in. But also this is a president who's acutely aware of the fact that he does not have much time. This is a one-term president. There won't be a second term to finish things. He starts in the beginning of his term. That meant the first year was going to be very, very busy and a little bit frantic as initiatives were rolled out right and left. I think right now we're taking stock of where we are. I think we'll see that at the Munich Security Conference. Things that we tried, things that we proposed, we're sorting out where we're going to be going. And I think it's going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you keep mentioning Marco Rubio, and he's certainly one of those people in the Trump administration who sound very transatlantic oriented, who repeat some of the statements that have been, have been put out by many administrations before. He's a traditionalist in some way of foreign policy, but he's not the only one. And when looking at the statements within the administration, I think the concern in many European countries, the public as well, is that there is an undermining of basic principles that that built the foundation of the alliance, namely Article 5. Article 5 is, of course, the clause of mutual defense, that an attack on one ally is an attack on all allies. And Trump repeatedly called into question that basic fundamental mechanism. And I think that's where the fear of European countries and societies comes from. So how would we in Europe, how can we be reassured that Europe is really, that the United States is actually a reliable ally?
Because of the strong history of our alliance, because of the strong support from the alliance, from this administration, from members of Congress. I know you've been reassured by many members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, that we remain committed to Article 5 and to NATO. I think that a lot of ideas are thrown up by U.S. officials that we may not pursue or correct it later, but I don't think there's any question that the NATO alliance is solid and isn't going anywhere.
But still, the president sometimes sounds, at least in public remarks, very different. And it's just hard to align that with the view that you just articulated, that NATO is that important. And you mentioned even the sacrifice of Allied soldiers in Afghanistan and other places. And when Trump held his speech in Davos, he was, well, I would say, disregarding these sacrifices by hinting that Europe would not come to the defense of the United States, when that actually was the case after 9/11.
The American people don't believe that. Trump corrected that misstatement already with the British, and I expect there'll be similar statements.
Okay. So you mentioned the war in Ukraine. And obviously, Russia's attack on Ukraine destabilized the European security architecture. The president promised to end that conflict within 24 hours. That has not materialized. Now, you were very optimistic that there can be, or that, well, you at least mentioned that there is progress because there are peace talks in Abu Dhabi right now. At the same time, when you wrote that proposal with Keith Kellogg, and you mentioned him, you worked with him, he was a special envoy for Ukraine, is now returning to your institute. That proposal included that if Russia would not accept a ceasefire, that in this case, the United States should increase, actually, the weapons deliveries to Ukraine. So we now exactly see the situation where Russia does not accept a ceasefire, is continuing to terrorize the people of Ukraine, attacking Ukraine, but there is no real response by the Trump administration. So would that not run counter to your own proposals?
I think the fact that the U.S. achieved trilateral talks was a small step forward. That wasn't something we would have predicted a couple of months ago. But I'll concede that Putin has shown no interest in peace. And I believe there will be a time when Trump's patience has run out and he will start implementing very, very tough economic and energy sanctions. And I think there also will be increased weapons provided to Ukraine. Now, whether we'll use this mechanism of selling them to NATO and NATO gives them to Ukraine, or I don't know what the mechanism will be. But I think Trump's patience with Putin has just about run out. And it's crucial to recognize that the Trump doctrine means before turning to military force, or before sending weapons to another country, he wants to exhaust all other elements of statecraft. And we saw the Alaska summit. It didn't work. But it was a nice try to maybe flatter Putin into seeing that there's another way, that he could have a better life, a better way for himself and his country if he was to make a deal with Trump. He should have taken that deal, but he didn't take it. So, you know, I think that what you're saying may be coming, and I believe Trump's patience is running out.
And in regards to what you mentioned in your presentation, the security guarantees, that's a very important point for Ukraine. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, how that would look like, the US contribution in particular?
I learned a lot from Rubio's testimony last week, in that he said the security guarantees would mean some deployment of U.S. forces on the ground after a peace agreement with Russia, and the U.S. would backstop those forces, which I assume means that we would commit to use military force to defend Ukraine if Russia violated a new peace agreement. Now, Rubio, I did not know we went that far in terms of this agreement. So Rubio said this in front of Senate testimony. This is a big change from where the U.S. was a few months ago. And I think it reflects some pretty significant input from European states who are pushing the coalition, they're willing very hard to try to find a way to get a peace agreement that is long-lasting in Ukraine. The problem is we have to get Putin to agree to the security guarantees arrangement. Right now, he's not willing to do that. But we first have to get an agreement with Ukraine and the Europeans on what it will look like. And assuming we can nail that down, I hope we can make progress with Russia.
But how would we then pressure Russia to accepting those terms?
I don't think there's going to be peace with Russia until Russia suffers enormous economic and energy pain. And I believe that the bipartisan bill that Lindsey Graham recently got Trump to give a green light to was part of that. This agreement that Trump struck with Prime Minister Modi of India to stop buying energy from Russia. If the Indians comply with that, that's going to put enormous pressure on Russia. And I think Europe has to do more too. I was really disappointed by President Macron, who gave a speech at Davos pleading for China to invest more in France. Why wasn't Macron asking the Chinese to stop buying energy from Russia, or demanding that President Xi help us stop the killing in Russia by cooperating on this? The U.S. can't do this together. And I think if we all put pressure on Russia and India and other buyers of Russian energy, we might move Putin to negotiate in good faith on a ceasefire.
Let's maybe broaden our perspective on foreign policy issues. You mentioned the rules-based international order, and that is, of course, a cornerstone of German foreign policy, of European foreign policy, for that matter. Many in Europe, again, that's referring to, I think, a consensus view in many European states that the Trump administration seems to rather dismantle that order in contrast to, just replacing or promoting or improving it. I can see why that might be seen as beneficial to the United States in terms of a America First argument. But why should other states support or follow the leadership of the United States when using brute force instead of multilateral institutions?
Well, I think we need to put this in a historical context. It's nice to say that we live in a rules-based international order and we strictly follow these rules, and states don't take military action without the approval of the UN. But we know that doesn't happen. When various states took action against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, that was outside the rules-based international order.
Well, there was a United Nations Security Council resolution.
Not the attacks that the British and the French conducted against Gaddafi. There are other things that the U.S. has done over time in Panama and in other areas that were outside the rules-based international order.
Yeah, that's true, of course.
We could find lots of instances. We have to live in a rules-based international order, but at the same time, I think we have to recognize there may be some conflicts and issues that have to be done outside of the UN. And I believe the action against Maduro could not be solved through the Security Council. And that's why the U.S. took the action it did. The action that Israel and the U.S. took against Iran, there were complaints this violated the UN Charter. But Iran was getting to a point where it would soon have so many missiles, its nuclear program had advanced so far, there would be nothing to stop it from building a missile with a nuclear warhead it could fire at Israel. So having academic debates, this violates the rules-based order because we took out Iran's nuclear program. I think this is sort of like arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. This is a necessary thing to do. It isn't the standard way of doing things, but I think that it was an example of realism and something that had to be done.
I guess the counter argument here would be that Trump actually created this situation by withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated under the Obama administration, and that actually within a multilateral framework ensured that Iran would not pursue nuclear weapons.
Well, that is a myth. The 2015 nuclear deal with Iran was a fraud. We know from nuclear documents that were stolen from Iran by the Israelis in 2018, there was massive cheating on that agreement. Iran was developing advanced centrifuge technologies, which is why it ramped up its centrifuge program so quickly after Trump withdrew from this deal. It allowed Iran to continue to engage in enrichment technologies so it could quickly make a jump to a bomb. How could we have a deal to stop Iran's nuclear program that allowed Iran to keep enriching uranium? Iran argued it was enriching uranium for peaceful purposes, but it didn't need to enrich. It couldn't actually use that enriched uranium to make nuclear weapons fuel. It was practicing to make nuclear bombs. Trump was absolutely right to withdraw from the JCPOA. The problem was that Obama wanted a nuclear deal as a legacy agreement. And we know there are states, including the French, who said at the time, there can't be a deal that lets Iran enrich uranium, lets Iran have a heavy water reactor. The U.S. strong-armed the French and got them to stop complaining about it, then everybody was on board. This was, we're not going to agree on this, I know, but I've done a lot of study on this. This was a bad deal, and Trump's withdrawal from the deal didn't lead Iran to make nuclear weapons. They've been after nuclear weapons for decades, and they never stopped that program.
Certainly there is some disagreement with, on that issue, but moving on, I think that one thing that really astonished me when looking at the first year of Trump was cutting back foreign aid. Because one cornerstone of US power was not only military might, but also soft power. And one part of soft power is foreign aid. The United States is a very rich country, very influential with capabilities in public health and other areas. And foreign aid was a really successful program overall. Fighting polio, getting rid of smallpox, fighting HIV infections across the globe. And now these programs and the institutions implementing these policies are gone. So I really have a hard time seeing how that improves US soft power.
These programs aren't gone. Many of them were suspended. Almost all of them will be reinstituted. And the reason they were suspended because findings by the Trump administration of enormous waste and corruption in some of these programs and money being spent on programs in some countries that were against American interests. Rubio is determined to turn back almost all these programs because we recognize not only is it in America's interest to engage in foreign aid, it's the right thing to do as a wealthy country.
Okay. I want to soon open the floor for discussions from you. And if you want to ask questions in German, please do so. We'll translate then. But I have one final question, and you'll excuse me if I, as a political scientist, introduce that with a theory, a theoretical take, if you will. And that is the argument about democratic peace. So that was this idea that cooperation between democracies is stable because these countries are functional democracies. So that was a view that was promoted by Woodrow Wilson, for example, when ending the First World War. So you could make the claim, and some scientists, some researchers do that the United States is not a fully fledged democracy anymore, because the Trump administration is attacking some fundamentals of democratic governance. For example, ignoring Congress, which funded the foreign aid programs, and the Trump administration did basically, you say, stop the funding, which is mandated by Congress. So that's just one example. I guess what I'm trying to say is, the more the democracy in the United States is under attack, the less cooperation between democracies, such as European democracies, is possible. How can you reassure us that this is not the trend, that I'm in the wrong?
I don't think democracy is under attack or being weakened in the United States, but I do believe that we are a coalition of democracies, and democracies are messy, and as we know, that there will be people who come to power and policies that come up that one side or the other may disagree with. The U.S. has differences with democracies in Europe, as you know, censorship. I think this is a bigger problem for the UK, and I've had arguments over that. I guess it's a perception in the media that democracy is under fire in the U.S., but I think it's alive and well. But I will concede that Congress's prerogatives over foreign policy have been significantly weakened, and not just by this president. Yeah. A lot of things have been done. There were a lot of agreements put forward by the Obama administration that were clearly treaties that were not put up for a Senate vote because they wouldn't get the 2/3 necessary to be ratified. There are a lot of presidents who have gone around Congress in that way. I think it's an issue, but also when these things happen, I think politics is like a pendulum, and when things move to one extreme, they're going to shift back. So I wouldn't worry too much about these reports about these issues happening between the Trump administration and Congress. And if there's a perception that this administration is misusing its authority, they're going to have to answer for that in the election this fall. I don't think the American people feel that way, but if you're right, it will be hard to keep the House and the Senate.
Okay, well, thank you for your honest answers. And this last point on the role of previous administrations and them ignoring congressional authorities, that's a clear area of agreement. I think it's true for the war powers. It's true for other areas of foreign policy. Okay, well, Dr. Jürg will pick up some questions.
Who was the quickest? I will start here.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking to us. So I have two questions, one more international and one more domestically for US politics. But I'll start with the international one. Due to kind of increased weaponization of the international economy, for example, tariffs, with Trump's move to put loyalists in charge of parts of the Fed, do you think that a strategy of the Trump administration going forward would be to weaponize the American dollar, which would of course have more severe impacts than tariffs do now on coercion of other states? And for domestically, you laid out a very optimistic picture of what the domestic situation in the United States looks like. On a more pessimistic note, of course, there's large fractions within the MAGA base, and with these fractions and the issues happening domestically right now, do you think that the Trump administration should implement maybe a policy of scalping a couple of the inner circle that you says works so well to restore a little bit of momentum ahead of the midterm elections? Pam Bondi comes to mind, for example.
Well, I'm not an economist. I can't give you a great answer to your first question, but Trump is dedicated to free, fair, and balanced trade. And the tariff strategy is being adapted and adjusted, and I think it's being adjusted in ways that many states favor. But this is a uniquely Trump approach to foreign policy and international economy. He wants to have trade that's fair. He wants to bring back manufacturing to the U.S. In many instances, those jobs are not coming back because for trade reasons and other reasons, there's just no way to move certain manufacturing jobs back. I think there's going to be a reckoning this year. As I said, a lot was done last year. A lot of policies that were very strong and orthodox were implemented, and I think there's going to be adjustments in 2026. You know, I read a lot of media stories that there's big divisions in the MAGA world, and for example, when Trump endorsed Israel attacking Iran, Tucker Carlson threw a fit, and some other MAGA people did. But really the number who objected was pretty small, and most of those who didn't agree with Trump's action didn't object too strongly because they said they trust him. I don't see a breakup in the MAGA world, frankly. I think there are some divisions. I think there's some outliers. But I think it is a movement that's sticking pretty closely together.
Yes, also thank you from my side. Since we're talking about foreign policy strategy, I'm wondering where the actual long-term strategy is, because you talk about working together internationally, but at the same time mention that you only want to work with the UN if it really suits the US. You talk about non-interventionism, at the same time mention the Monroe Doctrine. So I'm really wondering, as a partner of the US, what consistencies can we actually expect and hope for? What long-term strategy is there actually? So what overarching goal of what you call a strategy is there actually?
Well, the strategy is this Trump doctrine, America first, that tries to put American interests first, keep us out of unnecessary wars. But Trump's making the point that sometimes presidents have to use military force, and I don't think there'll be a lot of instances of that. I think Iran was an extraordinarily important case where the president took military action. I also think the unpredictability of a strong president is good for global security. I want President Putin, I want the Iranian leaders to worry about what Trump's going to do. There were reports during the first Trump term that Trump's unpredictability may be a reason Putin didn't invade Ukraine during Trump's first term. I don't know that that's true, but I have heard that. I think that American strength is good for global stability. I think Trump's efforts to promote peace is also good for global stability. I think Trump has earned a great deal of goodwill by being a decisive leader who will use force when necessary. And I think this discourages states that would try things to destabilize the world. So I think we're on a good track for a strong and decisive America, but I also believe we have to work very closely with our allies in promoting stability.
Also, thank you from my side, and thanks for having you here. My question is regarding the very recent national security strategy from last November. So you basically mentioned Greenland on no page of over 40 sites. Where does the very recent obsession of Greenland comes from, or Iceland, how your president says to it?
Well, I don't think Trump wants Iceland.
That's good to hear.
Trump made observations that he thinks the status of Greenland has to be updated, and he's not the only official who has said that. He's not the only person who believes that Denmark doesn't have the capability to properly defend and develop this territory. But Trump made very clear in Davos that he's not going to invade Greenland. There is a outlined plan to resolve his differences over it, and I think this issue is going to go away. It simply isn't important enough. This frozen wasteland has 55,000 people. How many people live in Heidelberg?
More.
It's not worth endangering this alliance. It's just not important enough. And I think the people of the U.S. and our friends in Europe will realize that. I know tensions were high for a while, but I think this will pass.
If I may, just a follow-up question on the Greenland case. I mean, this is one interpretation, right? So that Trump pushes allies to do more for their own security. But the question is it really necessary to threaten the use of force to extract some concessions on the part of allies that are very willing to offer increasing security commitments, maybe access to even resources in Greenland? And the interpretation that many in Europe now have from this episode is that if we are united and showing a hard line against the Trump administration's ideas, we can actually succeed in fending off some of the sort of most extreme policies that are coming out of Washington.
I think we need to put this Greenland issue behind us and talk about Ukraine and talk about Gaza. It's a distraction. It's really a distraction. There's an outline proposal to solve this. Whatever was said. I think that we have to move on. It's just not important enough when there's so many real issues out there that we need to deal with.
I agree that the war in Ukraine is more important, definitely.
Yeah, so many questions. So we start here.
Hi, thank you very much, Mr. Fleitz, for your thoughts and your presentation. Nevertheless, I have to come back, or let's put it differently. Partially, you sounded like a classical proponent of transatlantic relations, the rules-based international order, the defense of sovereign values. But why then the threats against Greenland, even if you thought it's not so important? We have to update the relations, but you can extend your military bases in Greenland without any problem. You have a defense agreement from 1951. You just can't extend it. Why the threats against Canada, annexation, Governor Carney, being the 51st state of the United States? Why all that? How does it go together with this transatlanticist tune of the defense of sovereign values and a multi-based international order? You say some actions have to be taken outside the rules-based international order, like Venezuela. What is the avail of taking out Maduro? You have Delcy Rodriguez, who is a member of the apparatus of the Maduro regime. What has changed? What has changed for the Venezuelan people? Thank you.
Look, Trump will be Trump, and he's a former New York businessman, real estate developer. He is pretty big on using rhetoric to get his way and to pressure people to get things done. I don't really have anything else to add on that. That's my answer. But concerning Venezuela, you make a very important point, and there were many people, including close Trump supporters, who were surprised that Maria Corina Machado, we didn't try to put her in power after we removed Maduro, and there were good reasons for this. There was a CIA assessment that if we try to do that, she didn't have the base to take over the country, she'd be overthrown, and there'd be mass chaos in the country. It's important to Trump not to repeat the mistakes of the past, especially the way we tried to engage in nation building in Iraq after the Second Iraq War, where we removed all the Ba'ath Party civil servants, let the army go. The country went into chaos. It led to the rise of ISIS. Trump doesn't want to occupy Venezuela. He's trying to find a way to work with the remnants of the Maduro regime, using our control of their oil industry, to pressure it to reform and to set the stage for elections. It's probably the best of many bad options, and I agree with you, it's pretty risky. And but there really isn't an easy way to put Machado in right now. But I think that's Trump's intention. But right now, he's trying to deal with the reality on the ground, that there's a lot of bad actors in that country that we can't easily dispose of. It's going to have to be done from within, and we're hoping we're going to have the cooperation of Rodriguez and her interim presidency.
One more question over here.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I learned a lot. It was also a lecture in Newspeak. You said America is a peace-loving country. America is bombing in Nigeria, is bombing in Yemen, is bombing in Iran, is funding the war in Gaza for a long time, and is threatening its own allies. It is difficult to qualify such a country as peace-loving, not to speak of Venezuela. My question is, do you really consider Trump as a mentally sane person? It is a serious question. A person who says, I don't feel obliged to think about peace because I was not awarded the Nobel Prize. Is it a sane assertion by a sane person? I think it is impossible to qualify such a person as mentally healthy. And then I would like to know what is the role of international law. I studied this strategy, there's a paper on the strategy, and I didn't find on a single spot the word international law. And then Trump openly says, you know, I do not need international law. My light fire are my own morals. And if such a man makes politics according to these morals, I think we come to a brink also in our alliance between Europe and the United States. Thank you.
I've studied national security for probably 40 years now, and I've been in a variety of national security jobs in different agencies. And that means there's certain things I'm not going to say because I understand the subtleties of what they mean and I understand the facts. Donald Trump is a former real estate developer and he makes mistakes. He says things that he's had to correct later and his staff has had to correct them. And Trump has a unique personality. I don't know what else to say to you about that. Concerning international law, I think when we look at Trump's foreign policy, there is a definite commitment to international law, but there's been action to deal with some conflicts that have been difficult to address through the UN. I believe that Trump is laying out the broad strokes for America's foreign policy, and I think that we are seeing how it is being defined and explained and implemented by Secretary of State Rubio, who I think has extraordinary ability. And I think it's good news for Trump that he has an advisor who's this competent and loyal to him, who is close to him. And I believe that we're going to see a very good reading of where the Trump foreign policy is after a year. As we're taking stock of so many developments over the past 13 months, where are we now? And I think we're going to hear that at the Munich Security Conference. So I would just keep an eye on
that. I'm a U.S. Army veteran. I have a NATO pin on my Army uniform. I had boots on the ground with my NATO allies. You say, let's not worry about Greenland, let's worry about the Ukraine. But I think Greenland could be a precursor for how we work together as allies in a conflict like Ukraine. My question is, and maybe I have a different perspective as my German friends here, but how can you, what would you tell soldiers, and I'm not talking American soldiers, I'm talking about our allies, our friends, our German soldiers, the French soldiers, the American, the UK soldiers. When I was in the Army 30 years ago, boots on the ground, like said, we had joint training exercises. Why can't there be like a joint training exercise in Greenland to show how we can work together and what that would mean working together as NATO allies, for instance, in the Ukraine?
I can just say that there's a framework agreement to resolve this. I think Trump made it clear that this issue was over at the Davos summit, and we'll hear more about it in Munich. I can see things like that may happen. I think that's going to be negotiated with NATO and with Denmark.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's come to light that a lot of the problems, or not problems, a lot of the difference that we see is a question of communication. Now, when I look at the America First and the way it was formulated, a big part seems to be that the America First strategy demonizes the rest of the world as taking advantages on the US. Now, I see that in stark denial of some of the truth in your own country. And I give you just 4 quick examples. The fight against migration completely leaves out the fact that you need and you have millions of unregistered immigrants that keep your agriculture sector working, right? If you basically deport all of them, your economy, agriculture would collapse. War on drugs, you're completely omitting that a lot of that is homemade, right? The opioid crisis is not drugs being imported into the US, it's your own pharmaceutical industry and the way you run your healthcare system, allowing people to take those drugs. Trade war, we have the supply chains diversified to the point that a lot of the stuff that used to be done in the US is now outsourced to China or everywhere else, while at the same time in the Rust Belt you have neglected to build up your own industry and upskill your workers to have more valuable jobs. And the last thing is tariffs are said to be penalties for the rest of the world, while at the same time the US citizens pay for them. It's not, you know, Europe paying the tariffs, it's your own citizens. So how will you eventually tell your own public that in order to come to a point where what you want is sustainable, you have to do some homework first in order to be trustworthy again? And in terms of communication, the one thing I would say, communication I can bank on is something like Mark Carney said in Davos. That's the tone communication should have, and not the communication that Donald Trump was basically saying. That's not believable in the way it is done. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your perspective. We're not going to agree on most of these issues, but let me just talk about one of them, and that is what you said, that there's a perception in the America First strategy that, what did you say, the world is out to get us, or the world's taking advantage of the United States. That's not correct. It is true that there's a belief that the U.S. has been taken advantage of in trade, and I think it has. But I believe that asking allies to pay more to defend their regions is something that's been called for by multiple presidents. Barack Obama called for this. Barack Obama wanted NATO states to pay their 2% of GDP. The difference is Obama didn't mean it, and Trump does. I mean, it's a serious issue to Trump. He thinks that it's a matter of fairness and that there's this issue of a limited amount of military capability. The U.S. has to use it in other areas. So I hear what you're saying. I appreciate your views.
Thank you very much for your insightful views here and for the boldness to show up here for the discussion. And thank you also very much for the tough questions you asked earlier. That's also very much appreciated. I have a very simple question. Do you think the US would sell Germany nuclear weapons? Now, the question looks a little bit simple, but of course, ultimately, it's going a little bit deeper because I know there are certain legal agreements existing. And I'm not necessarily interested in a legal answer to that question, more in a kind of long-term strategic answer.
I have never heard that idea, but I have heard the possibility that European states may want to have their own nuclear arsenal because they don't trust the U.S. I have a lot of friends in South Korea. There's a lot of interest in South Korea for South Korea to developing its own nuclear deterrent. Now, the Biden administration was dead set against that because they were worried about the precedent this would set for nonproliferation. If there was another nuclear power, it obviously would antagonize China and North Korea. I don't know what the Trump administration's position would be if the South Koreans decide to develop their own nuclear weapons. I think they probably would say this is their call, that we're not going to interfere with it. That's my personal opinion. I don't know where the Trump administration is, but that's what I've told my South Korean friends. And I don't know what the Trump administration would say if Germany tried to buy nuclear weapons. I don't think the U.S. would do that because of the severe classification and sensitivity of these weapons and technology. But in a highly academic sense, if Germany decided to develop its own nuclear arsenal, my personal opinion is that the U.S. would probably go along with it. I don't think future Democratic administrations would, though.
We are close to 9:30. We still have a lot of questions in the room. Let's see how many more we can take. I'm aiming for 5. So now I have to choose. I think you have been first, and then we continue.
Thank you for being here. I'm a high school student from Heidelberg, and there seems to be a trend in the world where superpowers take land that they think is theirs or think they belong to them, like Russia that takes Ukraine, or China that wants to take Taiwan, and also the USA who wants something like Venezuela or Cuba. And I want to have your opinion where this trend is going in the world, and how the US is in this trend where superpowers take land that isn't theirs, but they think it's theirs.
Well, I would dispute that the U.S. wants to take Venezuela or Cuba, but I don't deny that the U.S. is trying to reestablish the Monroe Doctrine to assert American leadership and one could say dominance in the Western Hemisphere to protect its interests. I think that's different than what Russia did. A war of aggression with 500,000 dead is an atrocity, and I don't think those two things are equivalent. I think what China is planning in Taiwan, and some experts say China could attack Taiwan by 2027. I think it's further off, but China's planning another atrocity against Taiwan. I mean, there will be a huge death toll if China attempts an amphibious invasion and a special operation attack against Taiwan. Now, a related argument I've heard is that by not throwing Russia out of Ukraine, by agreeing to a settlement where Russia doesn't give back all of Ukraine and Putin is not tried for war crimes, it may embolden President Xi to attack Taiwan. And I think there's some validity in that argument. That happened before Trump. I think the war in Ukraine could have been avoided with strong American leadership. And I think Biden's lack of leadership was a factor in this invasion. And it is a problem, because I think a precedent was set there that we have to live with now. The horse is out of the barn. But I don't agree that the U.S. is planning on seizing territory.
Good evening. If President Trump is working on a long-term policy, could you explain why he didn't try to renegotiate the nuclear agreement with Russia, which came to an end today, the SAT agreement?
You mean START 2?
Yes.
New START. The Trump administration had some differences with this treaty, I understand. There was controversy when it was first implemented because it allowed Russia to develop certain exotic weapons that the U.S. was not developing. I don't think we had any progress in getting Russia to agree to that. There's also a desire by the Trump administration to have nuclear disarmament agreements that include China, and China hasn't been willing to talk. I don't think that agreement is off the table forever. I just don't think the Trump administration has succeeded in negotiating it. And negotiating with Russia is difficult right now because of the war in Ukraine.
So the last three questions.
Okay, so you stated that democracy is not under threat in the US and that if people don't like the government, they could elect a different one. But this would mean that the government has the courage to go into a fair election. So I see a lot of approaches to not have fair elections, for example, gerrymandering, voter ID rules, or seizing of ballots in Georgia. So are you really convinced that this government has the courage to go into a fair election? Or are they maybe scared?
I think that when you have a government that implements, very aggressive partisan policies, there tends to be a shift to the other side at an election in the future. And I think the effort by the Trump administration to hold Congress is going to revolve around its ability to convince the American people that what they've been doing is in the interest of the American people, that they're maintaining the American system, that they're maintaining American security. But we all know that in our country, the political pendulum swings from one side to the other. I don't want it to swing in the other direction, but I'm aware that it can happen. And typically, incumbent presidents lose quite a few House seats in midterm elections. And the Trump administration is going to have an uphill battle to hold Congress. And, basically some people will be voting to hold the administration accountable. I think that a lot of these accusations may be unfair. You probably disagree with me, but we'll see what happens in November.
Good evening, and thank you for your positive views, which I didn't hear very often. Another question, in the press we read several reports about the intention of some people in the government to destabilize the European Union, that they actually don't like it, that they would like to break it up. And I also am concerned, or would be interested to know whether you think that these interferences or these accusations of, let's say, the freedom of speech or similar accusations that they are not guaranteed in Europe, that they are a very important part of the present administration's policy towards its allies. Thank you.
Well, concerning the European Union, there's no possibility the U.S. could break it up. But there has been strong criticism of the European Union, not just by Republicans, but mostly by Republicans. And Trump doesn't like the European Union, I think you probably know. He believes that it unfairly targets American companies. It's trying to spread rules, sometimes social rules, that companies in other countries have to adopt that we don't agree with. He believes that the huge fines against U.S. tech firms is simply an effort to protect European companies, and it's unfair. And this is a pretty strong belief by many Americans that the EU hasn't been operating in the interest of the American people, which isn't a surprise. It's a European Union. But still, there's tension because the perception in the U.S. is that U.S. companies have been treated unfairly. That's simply a fact. Concerning censorship, there's real concern by many in America about increased censorship, especially in the UK. I've talked about that already. It's an issue that I hope will be resolved. I think there's movements in European countries to address that. If there's efforts by government to shut down too much speech because they think it's hurtful, I think a line has to be cut, has to be drawn. Obviously, there's certain hateful or dangerous speech that needs to be outlawed, but I think in the UK they've gone overboard, and I'm hoping they'll see better.
So here comes our last question.
Thank you for being here. And I do not have a question. I would like to say I liked the optimistic view on the American-European ties you had, and I hear so much pessimism and so much negative, and I think there's a high risk of falling into a self-fulfilling prophecy and getting into trouble, and all these negative words that had been spoken, that we read in the media. I think it's not worth it to threaten these very good ties of the recent decades or recent generation. And thank you for being here with your optimistic view about the American-European relations.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fred Fleitz, for your insights into the American First approach. Thank you so much, Florian Böller, for your very informed questions. And thank you all so much for your very good questions. I must say I'm impressed by our audience. And yeah, so I think this is worth another applause, not only for them, but also for you. And please check out our other programs on Spotlight US. There's, for example, a new program, Bernd Greiner, on the inner wars of the US. So, because I think I'm very convinced that what we see, we can only understand if we look back and if we understand history. So this is an intent to bring in another perspective later on. It's not in the the printed program, but it's on our website because it's a brand new program. So now I wish you a good night, and yeah, continue to come to our programs and also to the debate clubs. I saw a lot of people here today who come to our US discussion group. And this is really a place to engage and discuss and hear different opinions. So it takes place every 2 weeks. And it's an invitation to come and say hello to that program. So, guten Abend noch.